chilling tales for dark nights.
I was jolted out of sleep when my 5-year-old son Kevin jumped on top of me. I let out a little yelp, both from the shock of the impact and from being ripped out of a deep sleep. A little disoriented, it took me a few minutes to figure out what was going on. Now, jumping up and down on the bed, Kevin yelled, "Fuzzy, come again! Fuzzy, come again!" I sighed, rubbed my eyes, and checked the clock. It wasn't even 6 o'clock in the morning yet. Kevin continued to jump ecstatically around the bed. By now, my wife was awake and very cranky. She looked over at the clock and, seeing the time, released a frustrated moan. "Kevin, can't you wait until at least 6? She murmured sleepily. She too had been sleeping soundly. "Fuzzy, come again. I told you you would." Kevin was too excited to care what time it was. It could have been 1 in the morning for all he cared. "He's back! He's back!" Fuzzy, as he called him, was what we assumed was Kevin's imaginary friend. Our son described him as a fuzzy, colorful creature that arrived in magical mist through his window every night, and they played together. Kevin claimed that Fuzzy could change colors and even his shape, but one detail never changed. He was always fuzzy. My wife and I both dismissed this as an imaginary friend phase, as we lived in a somewhat rural area outside of a minor city, and there was no one around to play with. Every morning, Kevin would tell us what he did with Fuzzy last night. His stories would include making puzzles, reading books, jumping around, and cuddling. The one thing that was weird, though, was the fact that Kevin had, at first, told us that Fuzzy didn't want us to know about his nightly visits. A bit of a put-off at first. I soon disregarded this as merely a child's need to feel special because he had a secret. Sometimes I felt the need to check on Kevin at night just to make sure everything was all right. The main reason I didn't was because Kevin was a very light sleeper, in contrast to me and my wife, who were very heavy sleepers, and I didn't want to run the risk of waking him up. Kevin had stopped talking about Fuzzy a couple of months back, so we just assumed that he had grown out of it. I didn't see anything wrong with Kevin bringing Fuzzy back. I was happy as long as he was happy. I was a stay-at-home dad. My wife worked in the city and was gone pretty much all day, so I kept an eye on Kevin as he wasn't in school yet. It did get rather annoying after a while, constantly being bombarded with stories of Fuzzy all day. I smiled at Kevin's enthusiasm, but deep down, I felt a sense of dread welling up at the idea of Fuzzy returning. I got up out of bed and left the room, leaving my wife to deal with Kevin, and went downstairs. While making breakfast, I decided to check the newspaper. A car had crashed on the interstate and no body had been found. In other news, a wealthy woman donated some money to the state for park improvements or something, claiming that their current condition was simply unacceptable. There was a short editorial on why kids were doing poorly in school and parenting suggestions on the topic. Next, I read that an old man who had been accused of pedophilia and using hallucinogens and other drugs to lure and abuse children had been arrested 3 months ago, but shortly after had been released from jail as there was not enough incriminating evidence. There was some sports stuff too, but I didn't bother checking that as I was never really into sports. Later that day, I was in Kevin's room cleaning up. It smelled funny in his room. In fact, the last time I remembered it smelling this way was the last time Kevin talked about Fuzzy. I thought about it for a moment, but decided to just dismiss it as just fermented body odor from him jumping around on his bed with his imaginary friend. I decided to open the window as it was giving me a headache. Looking out, I saw Kevin out in the yard playing with some of his toys. It had rained last night and the ground was soft and muddy, so I made sure to warn him not to go near the mud. I lowered my head to withdraw back into the room, but noticed something on the ground beneath the window. 2 holes, about a foot or so apart. The holes weren't that big, so I wasn't too concerned. It just bothered me as I couldn't think of anything that might have made them. I looked up to ask Kevin if he knew what they were, as I figured he might have been responsible. He'd moved somewhere else, though, and I didn't feel like chasing him down to asking about something so menial. The next day, I was wiping down a window in the dining room, which led directly below Kevin's room. The 2 holes caught my eye again. However, this time they were even bigger than before. At dinner, I decided to ask Kevin if he had been digging in the backyard. He said no, so I figured it must have been animals or something. That evening, something else occurred to me, and I sought out my son to ask him a question. I found Kevin in the living room. "Hey, Kevin," I began, "why does Fuzzy only come at night? You seem bored lately, and you never play with him during daytime." He simply shrugged. "I don't know," he replied. "He just doesn't." This was when things started to feel truly off. It had never occurred to me before that Kevin didn't play with Fuzzy during the daytime. I figured it was probably just his way of keeping Fuzzy in a more realistic light. If he brought Fuzzy out to show him to us, he would see that we clearly didn't believe in the fluffy piece of air next to him. Yeah, I told myself. That was it. That was why. Nothing much happened for the next week or so. My wife and I went to bed at 10 o'clock sharp, as usual. We let Kevin stay up later if he wanted to, so he could play with his imaginary friend. We didn't mind the noise he made. In fact, if we were asleep, we didn't hear it at all. Hell, the train couldn't wake us up once we hit deep sleep. Every night, Kevin would say something different about Fuzzy. One night, he apparently brought Fuzzy a cookie, which I strongly suspected he stole from the cookie jar, and another night he reported that he had flown through the clouds while riding on Fuzzy's back. We were happy that our child's imagination was healthy, but the nagging feeling that something was off about these incidents, it never went away. The next week, I had to start putting Kevin to bed at the same time my wife and I went to bed, and later on, earlier than us. School was coming up soon, and I wanted his biological clock set to a normal rhythm so that he could wake up early and on time for class. But of course, this disrupted his Fuzzy schedule, and he would not go to bed without a fight. As days passed, it was becoming visibly obvious that he was not going to sleep when he was supposed to, and was instead getting up after we both fell asleep. Dark circles soon formed around Kevin's eyes. He became whinier than ever and nearly impossible to deal with, leaving me utterly exhausted every day. Needless to say, I had no trouble falling asleep that week. I was getting sick of my authority being undermined, so I made the decision to stay up late one night in order to catch Kevin in the act. I went to bed as normal, got up and moved to a chair, and after about 30 minutes spent sitting there in silence, I began to doze off. At that point, I decided I needed some help in my stakeout, so I crept downstairs to make a quick batch of coffee. The feeling that something was wrong never left me. It felt as if my paternal instincts were sending me one warning after another, but I didn't know why. I stood in the kitchen, sipping my coffee for what seemed like ages. Frequently glancing at the clock didn't help. I spent most of the time reading the newspaper, and every time I began to doze off, I refilled my mug with another steaming dose of caffeine. Having grown accustomed to the silence, I jumped a little when I heard a dull thud coming from upstairs. I checked the time, which read midnight. I had no idea Kevin had the capacity to wait for more than 3 hours just for a stupid imaginary friend. I quietly set my stuff down on the kitchen table and tiptoed to the stairs. I made sure to avoid the creaking steps as I slowly ascended into the darkness of the second floor. Just as I reached the top step, I heard Kevin's voice from down the hallway. "Fuzzy!" he exclaimed in joy, not a hint of sleepiness in his voice. By that time, it was blindingly obvious that Kevin had been awake and for some time. Then, as I slowly made my way down the hallway, I heard another thump emanate from Kevin's room. I thought about calling out his name and scolding him right then, but decided against it, as it would only serve to alert him to my presence and allow him to retreat under the covers and pretend he was asleep. The feeling that something was wrong grew immeasurably then, until it was nearly unbearable. A soft hissing noise was audible then, coming from the direction of Kevin's bedroom. I reached the door, gulping. I quietly gripped the handle, turned it, and pushed. As I opened the door, Kevin's bedroom window came into view. It was wide open, and in it I saw a ladder. I flung the door wide open and nearly fainted. There, in the middle of the room, enveloped in a noxious fog, was an elderly man, covered in body hair from head to toe, wearing nothing but a gas mask. And there, too, was my son, sprawled across his bed, a hose up his nose, spewing hallucinogenic gas.
Chilling tales for dark nights.